Hi, I'm Chris with Afflictor, and today we're going to talk about the biggest mistakes hunters make when testing arrow flight. Stay tuned. So when it comes to testing arrow flight, there's a few things to consider to make sure that you're seeing consistency across the board with your testing. Now, there's a lot of factors and variables, but we're going to hone in on a few that you really need to consider when you're putting your arrows together, the way you're practicing, how things are set up. So we're going to touch on a few of those items today, and hopefully it'll help you get more consistent flight out of your arrows when you're testing. The first thing we want to talk about is, of course, consistency of your arrow. When I first got into bow hunting, I had a mutt of a quiver. I had several different weights and sizes and fletching and who knows what. And I had to learn which arrows flew a certain way to be able to have any consistency at all. Well, nowadays you don't see that very often. Everybody's got at least a consistent batch of arrows, but is that batch of arrows really consistent? You need to inspect them to make sure. It's a really good idea to weigh your setup. Check it for straightness, make sure there's no flaws, make sure that everything is the same. The fletching, the nock, the insert, the way it's glued in, it's not heavier on one end with glue or the other. Making sure that your arrows all match and are consistent is the first thing you need to do before you even consider trying to get the best flight out of a batch of arrows. One of the other things that you need to take into consideration is your hunting versus your target setup. What are you primarily going to do? I know a lot of people that have a totally separate setup, bow and arrows for target, than they do their hunting scenario. But a lot of the 3D shooters are hunters and they're going to use the same thing. So you want to try to be as consistent as possible. When I practice primarily with the broadhead that I'm going to be hunting with. That way I am very confident, I'm sure of everything that's going on, and I'm very sure of how that arrow is going to fly. And I do that with all of my arrows, testing them to make sure that they are consistent and that they are flying right. The biggest mistake you can make is checking your target setup and then assuming you can screw a broadhead on the end of it and have a good stable arrow that's going to do what you're expecting it to do for a hunting scenario. Now in some cases, of course, they're going to match, they're going to be right there, but in a lot of cases they are not. So you want to be sure that your hunting setup is what you are also practicing with, so you can be sure that you're doing the best for yourself and the animal that you're hunting. It's very important at that stage to get the best flight out of your arrow to be using the broadhead you're going to hunt with. Another common mistake that we see a lot is that hunters will practice specifically at maybe 1 or 2 different yardages. It is important to know your yardages and how your arrow is going to fly from 10 yards all the way to the farthest distance that you plan on shooting, because you don't ever know the scenario that you're going to encounter. Now, if you're one of those persons that has set your stand or your blind up in a certain spot and the deer are going to be in a certain area and you know that and you're not going to deviate from that, that's one thing. But let's face it, hunting is hunting. We don't know what's going to happen. And if you've only practiced at 20, 25, 30 yards and the buck of the lifetime is standing at 40, are you really sure that you have practice with your arrow, your broadhead, and you know where that's going to go? So when you're practicing to get the best flight out of your arrow, to be the most consistent, again, use your hunting setup with your broadhead and practice at a lot of different yardages. You want to make sure that you're practicing close and that you're practicing the farthest shot that you think that you may take. Also, it's a good idea to practice from the elevation you think you're going to hunt from to make sure that any deviation in drop is accounted for as well. If you're only practicing on flat ground and you get up really high and now all of a sudden you got a deer that's basically under your stand, there's a lot of difference between the pin you're going to use when that deer is on the ground than when you're shooting from almost directly straight down at it. So you want to make sure that you know where that arrow is going to go in that circumstance and at that distance. One thing that's often looked over when you're trying to get the best consistency out of your arrow flight, it's not just the arrow, it's you, the archer. And it is very important that you are also being consistent. And there's a few factors here that you should really consider. And the first is your anchor point. You want to make sure that your anchor point is the same thing every time, that you are very consistent with it. Just play in your mind, where am I anchoring? Are you coming back? Are you using your thumb? Are you touching yourself on the ear? Wherever you are at, you want to make sure that mentally you are in that position every time you release your arrow, and then that way you know that your anchor point is definitely solid. The other thing that you want to make sure is that your release is also the same every single time. As you hit that trigger, or if you have back tension, however you've decided to release that arrow, you want to make sure that you're consistently doing it the same way every time. Pulling back, following through, whatever your routine is, you want to be able to maintain that. It is a really good idea when you're practicing to get the best arrow flight to walk through a few little steps. I'm anchoring here, I'm pulling back, my release is set. As I'm looking through my peep, my sight is in a perfect circle. However you are practicing, that will also help you get the best arrow flight in your hunting setup as well. You're drawing back on a whitetail or whatever you're hunting, and you played those few steps back in your mind, and it'll help you from making a mistake because the adrenaline is pumping, right? So you want to make sure that you have that anchor point, the release, that your sight is proper, and also that you have great string clearance for that string to clear all of your hunting clothes, because you probably didn't practice in those, right?